In 1902, a sealed attic in Virginia revealed a portrait no one remembered taking. Its edges were curled with mold, its subjects rigid and unblinking. 3 members of the Sullivan family posed in solemn stillness. Behind them, barely visible in the faded photograph, was a cellar door with iron hinges and something darker seeping up through the grain of the wall. The archivist who uncovered it would later write, "Their eyes. I thought they were looking at me." But this portrait was not taken in 1902. It was inked in silver nitrate in the year of our Lord, 1834. And what it concealed was not merely a forgotten image, but the threshold to the most sealed room in all of Virginia folklore. The Sullivans of Black Hollow were considered pious folk by the parish registers. Elias Sullivan had once been a lay preacher, quiet and orderly, who held services from the parlor of his estate when the chapel down valley flooded in spring. His wife, Prudence, was rarely seen without her rosary, though some said it was stitched with beads of bone. Their youngest, Isaac, remained unmarried well into his 30s, drifting like a ghost through the narrow market paths of Holloridge. Yet beneath their house, a house built on consecrated soil, the floor plan did not align. Neighbors whispered of hollow knocks beneath the fireplace, of whimpers in the fog, of children who'd gone into the Sullivan household to learn their letters and never returned. But it wasn't until 1861, when the estate was sold off after the Civil War, that carpenters breaking up the hearth discovered the first iron ring bolted to the stone below. And even then, they stopped digging. It would take another 70 years and a quiet investigation into misfiled birth ledgers to bring authorities back. What they found behind the cellar door still stains the records with deliberate omissions. 47 small iron rings embedded in the stone. 47 chains, some broken, most still taut. No remains, only deep clawing in the rock, etched not by animals, but hands, and scripture, dozens of verses, scratched in reverse along the ceiling beams. There was no trial, no names listed in the official record. The house was burned in 1933, and no stone was kept. But the photograph remained, sealed in attic dark, forgotten until it blinked into light again. Subscribe if you believe silence hides the deepest truth. And tell me, what would you do if the portrait on your wall blinked? The estate, once known as Black Hollow House, stood at the edge of a sloping wood, half swallowed by sycamores whose roots cracked the stone path like arthritic fingers. By the time the federal surveyor passed through in 1911, the roof had long since buckled, and the cellar doors had been nailed shut with 7 rusted spikes driven in a crooked cross. No one claimed the land, and no map marked the basement. The Sullivan family was never listed among the region's founders, yet their name appears on an 1832 deed, sealed with a crimson wax stamp bearing a fish pierced by a nail, an emblem not found in any diocesan archive. Within the records of St. Harrow's Parish, the Sullivans are noted only in margin scrawl. Elias Sullivan is described not as a preacher, but a keeper of catechumens. The term, archaic and rarely used even in the 19th century, typically referred to those who oversaw the spiritual instruction of unbaptized converts. But in this instance, there is no mention of any converts, only a tally mark repeated 47 times beside his name. No parishioners recall attending services there. And yet church hymnals from 1833 to 1835 were found with pages torn precisely at the same hymn, "Let No Lamb Be Lost," a funeral hymn reserved not for the dead, but for those presumed too sinful to be mourned. Local children, as late as 1915, referred to the ruin as the Cradle House. They claimed that if one placed their ear to the cracked foundation, they could hear a humming, not voices, but something between breathing and vibration, like strings plucked without sound. One letter from 1842, addressed to the diocesan bishop and never answered, states plainly, "The Sullivan boy does not age, he is kept inside. They bring him pale bread and water on the Sabbath, and his eyes do not shut." That letter was unsigned. Elias and Prudence Sullivan are buried under unmarked stones, weathered to smoothness beside a dried creek bed. Their son, Isaac, was never recorded as dead, nor alive. The last census that listed his name includes only one note beside his age. No change, no light. And still the cellar beneath Black Hollow sits sealed, the rings cold, the chains empty. But the etchings remain. The scripture that lines the Sullivan cellar is not unfamiliar. Each verse is known to scholars, taken from the Gospel of Matthew, the Epistle to the Romans, and fragments of the Book of Job, but all have been carved backward, as if to be read by eyes that see from beneath or behind. Verses such as, "Whoso shall offend one of these little ones," and "They shall seek death and shall not find it." The most common line appears 13 times, etched into the stone as though traced by a child's trembling finger. The least of these shall become the root. When researchers attempted to match the carvings to any known sect, they found a peculiar pattern. Identical reverse script phrases appeared once before in an 1829 chapel fire in Pennhurst, Pennsylvania, and again in 1847 carved into the pews of the St. Blaise Orphanage ruins in upstate New York. Both locations were associated with closed investigations into missing children. Both had once been led by visiting clergy from Southern Virginia. The church, when questioned, offered no comment. Inside the cellar itself, the chains are rusted through in places, but most remain anchored with brutal precision, rings spaced evenly in concentric ovals, surrounding a darkened stone recess in the floor no wider than a cradle. Beneath this recess, excavators discovered fragments of cloth, uniform in size, scorched at the hem, a single shoe, a broken quill, and one journal, now kept in a humidity-sealed vault at the University of Virginia, its spine broken, its entries nearly illegible except for a single repeated phrase. "We sang the hymn, and they quieted. We sang the hymn, and they quieted." The final page ends with a smeared, inked drawing, a ring of faces, eyeless, open-mouthed, circling a dark pit. And above the pit, hovering just out of reach, the image of a cross, not inverted, but hollow. No one claimed authorship. The ink was tested. It contained traces of lamb's blood. By 1851, local folklore had already begun to twist the truth, turning the Sullivan house into legend. Children dared each other to knock 3 times on the cellar door. A school teacher claimed her cousin vanished there after searching for coins in the foundation. The house, by then sagging and draped in rot, was given a new name by the town's elders, the Singing Place. It was not a term of affection. Old women spoke of dreams filled with lullabies sung in reverse, of cradles rocking with no child inside, of a staircase winding endlessly downward, beneath which something waited not to be found, but remembered. One elderly witness, interviewed in 1931 before her death, described the house this way: "The windows breathed. The air inside was wrong, like the building exhaled just before you opened the door." She also mentioned that birds would not nest within 50 feet of the Sullivan ruins. Bees refused the wood, and dogs, when brought near, would howl, then whimper, pressing their bellies to the dirt. And still, no official marker stood. In 1876, a fire swept through Black Hollow, some believe intentionally. The house burned to its foundation, though the cellar stone remained untouched. Only one artifact was recovered from the wreckage: a rusted iron cross fused to what appeared to be a child's writing tablet. The words burned into the wood? "He came in white and called us by number." That artifact, too, has vanished. In 1904, the ground was surveyed for railroad expansion. Workers refused to dig the eastern slope, claiming their tools bent when striking something just below the soil. One reported hearing children speaking in breathless tongues. Another fell down the slope and was never found. His name was Asa Whitmore, and his boot was discovered 3 days later, stuffed with pages from a hymnal, soaked through but unburnt. The project was abandoned, even today, the Lohad, and remains undeveloped. Visitors report compasses spinning wildly and the sensation of being watched just beyond the tree line. The cellar stones remain. The air above them is always still, as if something below it has never stopped listening. Among the strangest finds in the Sullivan ruins was the altar stone, moved from the original Black Hollow Chapel sometime between 1828 and 1832. It bears no consecration mark. Instead, etched beneath its base were these words in Latin: Lux in tenebris, non reversura. The light in darkness, not to return. This was not church Latin, not truly. It echoes language found in a banned 17th century text known as the Monastery of the Hollowing Light, a tome declared heretical in 1689 for its theories on spiritual reversals, suggesting that false sainthood could be constructed through prolonged ritual deprivation of the innocent. That book, long thought destroyed, included drawings of children arranged in geometric formations, eyes covered, ears sealed, and mouths stitched shut, not in cruelty, but to still the soul for divine inversion. The Sullivans, it seems, took this scripture to heart. There is no evidence that Elias Sullivan was ordained in any traditional capacity, yet among the burnt remains of his study was found a faux episcopal ring, crafted not of gold but bone, and a cracked chalice filled with dust that tested positive for human calcium. Beside the cellar entrance, a hymn board still stood. The numbers read 13, 47, 7. The numbers match no known hymnal index, but cross-referenced against the Hollowing Light text, they correspond to the Canticle of Cradles, the Litany of the Lost, and the Benediction without light. Each song begins with silence. Each ends with a verse repeated backwards, and each was meant not to be sung aloud, but absorbed through deprivation. Scholars believe the Sullivan rituals were designed not to summon anything, but to keep something from returning. But if so, the question remains: what exactly did they believe was beneath them, and why, when found, were the children's chains still cold to the touch? Of all the questions that echo through the ruins of Black Hollow, one name lingers longer than the rest: Isaac Sullivan. Born in 1801, according to the only surviving record, a birth note inked in the back pages of a Sullivan Family Bible, Isaac was never confirmed into the church, never married, and never listed in any educational ledger. Yet his name appears every decade in local census notes until 1890. Always the same age, 33. Always the same note beside his line: resident of estate, seen at window. But no visitor, not even postmen or tax collectors, ever spoke to him directly. The earliest description dates to 1837, when a parish deacon reported visiting the Sullivan house after a neighboring widow accused them of grave soil theft. The deacon claimed he was not invited in, but stood at the threshold, where he glimpsed a pale figure standing behind a curtain, unmoving, his face drawn and luminous like milk glass left in shadow. He described Isaac's skin as cold glowing and his hair as black, despite his supposed age. The deacon left without further inquiry. In 1859, a traveling physician passing through Black Hollow made note of a man in the window watching his wagon pass. The physician assumed it was a house servant, until he described the features to the innkeeper and was met with silence. The innkeeper, an old woman named Mercy Chisholm, answered only this: "That boy ain't left that window since my own ma nursed me." Isaac's last recorded appearance was noted in a 1901 letter from a photographer cataloging derelict estates for the State Historical Record. He took 3 plates of the Sullivan house. Only one developed fully. In it, the parlor curtains are drawn wide, and there, in the far left window pane, is a figure, skin smooth, eyes misaligned, a faint scar crossing the brow like a thread left half pulled. The photo is now kept in sealed archives. A preservationist who attempted to restore the image by hand later described the figure's face as resisting pencil, like the lines kept moving when I turned away. She quit her post shortly after. Isaac Sullivan, if alive, would be over 220 years old, but the official record ends with these words: unaged, uninterred, unknown. Much of what we know about the Sullivan basement comes not from the house itself, but from a ledger recovered from the nearby chapel, a small wooden structure called St. Bethel's Retreat, now reduced to ash and lichen-covered stone. Inside a rusted donation box was a scroll, sealed with wax and twine, marked with the sign of the pierced fish. The scroll, dated 1833, was titled, "Concerning the 47." The writing is disjointed, more fever than form, but patterns emerge. The scroll describes a covenant of binding enacted every seventh night when the moon was hidden. The language shifts between sacred Latin and a corrupted German dialect, but this phrase repeats throughout. They must not speak, they must not see, or the hollow opens again. It lists the names of saints not recognized by any church record: Saint Erith of the Broken Choir, Saint Malevin of the Veil, Saint Oriel of the Pale Mouth. Each saint is associated with a number, a direction, and an hour, ritual positions, and always 47 voices. Each voice, the scroll says, must begin with silence and end with surrender. Each must be tethered to the ring of earth for 7 cycles. Then the word quieten, not quiet, but a verb, as if to render still, extinguish. Those familiar with ritual containment recognize elements of spiritual inversion, sacrifices not made to appease but to hold back, to suppress emergence. Yet nothing in the scroll names what was being held. Only this passage offers a glimpse. It crawls up through root and breath. It licks the underside of our light. Its name must be broken into 47 syllables to remain sealed. Beneath the scroll was found a small fragment of white cloth, rolled tight and scorched at one edge. Faint ink marks across its surface, visible only under light, spell the word Isaakiel. It is not a known name, but in apocryphal writings, a similar tier. Isaakiel appears once in the Codex of St. Lyra as a failed angel of reversal, one who fell upward into silence. This name, paired with the number 47, appears again beneath the Sullivan cellar, etched in childlike script into the side of a stone ring. It was carved with a spoon. Though the Sullivan house was burned in 1933 and the basement sealed with mortar, the whispers have never quieted. In fact, they have returned. Beginning in 1952, there were 5 independent reports from hikers in the Black Hollow region, claiming to have seen a man standing alone at the tree line, always pale, always still, wearing an outdated coat and cravat, unmoving even in wind. One man, a forestry volunteer, described the figure turning without walking. He said, "It turned like a hinge, no footfall, no sound, just turned." When rangers returned to search the area, they found the impressions of feet near the old estate foundation, but the soil showed no other signs of approach or retreat, just 2 footprints, perfectly still, 7 feet apart. In 1969, a journalist investigating orphan disappearances in surrounding counties noted a peculiar pattern. Each missing child case within a 50-mile radius occurred on the 7th Sunday of the year. No connection was made until she matched the dates against an old Sullivan chapel calendar preserved in a museum basement. Every date aligned with the ritual listed in the Concerning the 47 scroll. The journalist, Ruth Aidens, vanished 3 weeks later. Her recorder was found in a dry creek bed, still spinning, its last audible line. "They're singing below me. I can't see them, but I hear breath like rope on stone." The authorities dismissed the case as tragic coincidence. By 1974, the church formally denied any connection to the Sullivan site. The land was purchased quietly by a private historical society with no known board members and sealed under a conservation order. No public access has been granted since. But as recently as 2006, a group of amateur documentarians attempting to film at the site were arrested. One later told a podcast host, "We didn't find the basement, but we heard the latch lift." She refused to say more. She now teaches kindergarten in another state and has legally changed her name. Still, there are those who claim the singing continues. Not in volume, but in presence. A hum beneath the fog. A silence so loud it presses against the chest like stone. Among the last known objects recovered from the Sullivan site before it was sealed was a wooden cross, simple in design, about 7 inches tall. It was found split perfectly down the middle but not shattered. It had been pried apart, hinge-like, as if opened. Inside the hollow cavity were strands of blackened thread, a baby tooth, and 1 page from a children's primer, marked with the letter I. On the reverse side of the primer page was scrawled a prayer, but when reversed in a mirror, it read not as petition but declaration. "I do not follow the light. I bind it underfoot." This is not a prayer known to any Christian tradition. Historians who examined the piece noted the wood bore no signs of rot, despite being pulled from a damp foundation. and emitted an odor reminiscent of frankincense mixed with something metallic. The cross, now housed in a sealed display at the St. Ashwell Seminary archives, has been known to set off motion alarms in the dead of night. Once the camera caught a flicker of light from inside the glass case. Security reported no breach, but the archivist who filed the report noted one disturbing detail. When reviewing the footage, the cross was no longer split. It appeared whole, restored, until the footage blinked and it was cracked again. Religious scholars familiar with apocryphal artifacts call this sanctified recoil, the unnatural reconstitution of a sacred object in the presence of reversed intention. In lay terms, the object remembers what it was and what was forced into it. The broken cross from the Sullivan estate now bears a new inscription etched beneath its glass case. This was not broken in anger, but in warning. Beside the display sits a small hand mirror. Viewers are encouraged not to look into it. Some still do. They report seeing a face, not their own, but one familiar, distant, pale, and staring back through the wrong side of the glass. By now, you may be wondering what was beneath the Sullivan home, what the chains held, what the hymns were trying to hush, why 47 voices were needed. The answer is not simple, but one clue may be found in the soil itself. When the estate grounds were briefly examined in 1983 by an archaeological team unaware of the site's history, they uncovered a strange anomaly, a concentration of human calcium deposits embedded in the dirt, not in bones, but dust, scattered, thin, as if sifted through cloth. Tests showed the presence of at least 12 different DNA profiles, all juvenile. No skeletons, no marrow, no burn marks, just dust. And beneath it all, stone grooved in concentric rings. Not natural erosion, but wear patterns, as if something beneath had been turning slowly for years, like a wheel or a mouth. At the center of the rings was a shaft, now filled in with concrete. Local legend calls it the hollowing pit. Older maps of the property, long lost but recovered in part by preservationists, show a peculiar symbol at this exact spot. A circle with 7 lines descending from it like roots. No key explains the symbol, but in ancient liturgical art, such markings are known to signify reversed sanctum, a sacred place forcibly bound, not blessed. There is no official explanation, only rumor and silence. One whispered account, recorded in 1934, describes a final prayer carved in the last timber of the Sullivan house before it burned. The choir has gone below, let no bell be rung. And it is true. The bell tower at St. Bethel's was removed long before the estate fell. It was dismantled in 1835 and melted down. Why? No record remains, only a receipt for iron rings, 47 of them, specially ordered, never refunded. In a sealed drawer beneath the ruins of St. Bethel's Chapel, hidden beneath a stone floor tile marked with an inverted lily, researchers recovered a bundle of paper, brittle, soot-streaked, and bound with black twine. They were labeled simply, Sermons of the Hollow. The name Elias Sullivan appears nowhere within, but the handwriting matches other scraps found near the Sullivan estate. The sermons read more like invocations than teachings, part scripture, part confession, and part mathematical notation. One fragment begins, "Light cannot reach beneath birth. We are born above, but not for long. The voice must descend." In place of benedictions, the texts end in sequences of numbers, each one a set of 47 digits. The digits do not repeat. No codebreaker has resolved them. In another sermon, a passage reads, "They were not children when we began. They were vessels, still echoing, but they became more. They sang not with voice, but through the rings, through the stone, and we were kept safe." The last page is written in mirror text and reads only, "He walks in the corridor between ribs." There are no dates, no signatures, no mention of Christ or God or the Holy Spirit. Instead, names appear like invocations. Saint Erath, Saint Auriel, Saint Malavan. And again, the name that should not exist, Isaakiel. The author describes himself not as preacher, but witness. If Elias Sullivan wrote these sermons, then he saw himself not as a guide to faith, but as a warden, a gatekeeper, one who taught not to enlighten, but to muffle. This may explain why no graves for the 47 were ever found. They were not mourned, they were not buried, they were bound. In a final line, almost illegible, the ink stained and running down the page, the author writes, "If you hear the cradle, it is not empty." The sermon pages are now kept in a university vault. One researcher who handled them, claimed his hands retained a faint vibration for hours after, and when he pressed his fingers to the vault glass weeks later, the vibration returned. In 1946, a Jesuit investigator from Baltimore, Father Lucien Marais, was dispatched privately to examine the Black Hollow site following multiple reports of unease, voices in fog, and sightings of unmoving children on the edge of the ruins. Though acting unofficially, Father Marais documented his findings in 42 pages of handwritten notes later acquired by the diocesan archive. He arrived alone, stayed 3 nights. On the second night, he reported the following. "I knelt where the altar once stood. Beneath my knees the stone was warm. I recited the rite of binding and began the litany of the saints. On the 7th invocation, I felt air move behind me, though no wind stirred. It was not breath, it was pressure, a gaze." He later added, "No demon answered, no wailing, no shriek. It is not infernal, it is not spiritual, it is something else, something fixed into place, waiting to be heard." Father Marais performed a minor exorcism rite at the edge of the cellar and placed sacramental salt at each corner. The next morning he returned to find the salt dissolved. The air smelled faintly of milk and iron. On the final page of his journal he writes, "The house is not haunted, it is occupied. Not by spirit, but by resonance, a hymn no ear should hear." He returned to Baltimore and died 2 months later in his sleep. An autopsy revealed no cause of death, but his mouth was found sewn shut, with thread, no needle marks, no trauma, just thread, as if grown from the lips inward. The church made no public comment. His notes were filed under non-canonical disturbances. Since then, no sanctioned exorcisms have been attempted at Black Hollow. The presence, it seems, does not possess. It does not move. It only listens. Those who speak of the site now describe a kind of unbearable stillness. Not silence, but the feeling of being one wrong word away from being heard. It is said that if who speak the name Isaakiel aloud in that valley, something shifts beneath your feet, like a cradle swaying gently or a lid sliding open. There exists, in a hidden drawer of the Virginia State Hymnal Archive, a torn folio labeled Unknown 1834. Its parchment is cracked, scorched along the top edge, and wrapped in a cloth bearing the faint outline of a child's hand. Written in musical notation, but lacking any key signature, the hymn is untitled. At first glance, it appears unfinished, just a melody, drifting downward, descending across a single octave. But played aloud, the hymn has a peculiar effect. Listeners describe an internal echo, a sensation that the final note continues long after the sound fades, as if it sinks into the body and waits. One historian compared the final note to the intake of breath before a sob. It is not beautiful, it is not discordant, it simply endures. When a choir attempted to record the hymn in 1981, the audio captured only the first 46 notes. The final note, though sung clearly in the studio, never appeared on tape. Instead, a faint scratching sound emerged, like metal dragging across stone. The tape has never been released. Further examination of the folio revealed faint writing on the back in reversed ink. This is the 47th. No other lyrics appear. It's been suggested this hymn was composed for the final ritual performed in the Sullivan basement, the last night the 47 voices were assembled. But one unsettling detail emerges from the document's margin, a small notation, hand-drawn in the shape of an eye, but with no pupil, only emptiness. This symbol matches a carving found on a stone just outside the Sullivan cellar. The stone is broken, but its surface still bears an inscription. When the final note is sung, the eye opens from within. Some believe the hymn was never meant to be completed, that the 47th note is a seal, a final tether, and should it ever be heard aloud again, whatever slumbers beneath will not return to sleep. One archivist who Ali hummed the full line, reported waking in the night to the sound of children weeping through her vents. No children lived in her building. The hymn folio now sits in a locked drawer. It is marked, "Do not finish." After the Black Hollow land was sealed by private conservation order in 1971, no further excavations were permitted. But before the order took effect, a small group of unofficial researchers, calling themselves the Order of the Empty Choir, claimed to have extracted several soil samples from beneath what they believed to be the original foundation. The results were unnatural. The soil was black, but not from rot. Under microscope, it revealed minuscule spiral patterns, bone dust, coiled like shells, not scattered like decay. Each spiral was precisely 7 millimeters across. Each one bore a center void, as if something had been drawn through it. Even more disturbing, the dust resisted heat. It would not burn, not even under direct flame. It remained cold. One researcher, attempting to dissolve the sample in lye, instead observed the liquid separate into concentric rings, exactly 47, counted meticulously before the outermost faded. The sample was sealed and labeled unclassifiable. None of the team returned to Black Hollow. Their final written note read, "The choir does not decompose, it only waits." Later, when a state preservationist attempted to core drill near the eastern slope, the drill bit broke. A replacement shattered. A third turned warm and bent inward, as if folding toward a hollow center. When the drill was withdrawn, the technician reported hearing a faint exhalation from the borehole. No wind, just breath. The sound was recorded. When played back, it revealed a strange cadence, like syllables spoken through water. A linguist later transcribed it phonetically and discovered 7 words repeated: "Return the ring, return the ring, return the ring." There was no ring present, only earth and silence. Today, the slope is marked only by a small iron post with no inscription. Visitors say it draws the eye without meaning to. That standing near it, causes a pressure behind the sternum, and that at certain hours you can hear it whisper, not in your ear, but in the back of your throat. In 1996, an anonymous letter arrived at a small historical journal in Virginia. It was unsigned, unmarked, and written in a trembling hand. The writer claimed to be the last living descendant of the Sullivan line. The letter read, "My name is not important. I have no church, no home, only memory. My grandmother was born in that house. She told me things no child should hear. She said the chains were not for punishment. They were for tuning. She said Elias spoke to the walls, that the walls answered. She said Isaac never slept. He watched, always watched, but his eyes moved only when no one looked." The letter continued, describing a memory passed down through generations, of lullabies sung backwards, of mouthfuls of salt pressed to the tongue to mute the echo, and of a final ritual that was never completed. There were only 46. The 47th never came. So they sealed the ring and placed the portrait in the attic, to remember what wasn't done. The writer claims to have gone back to the estate grounds once, as a child. He found the cellar stone, touched it, and felt something move beneath his skin. The letter ends with a single final line: "If you hear the cradle begin to rock, do not sing." The editors dismissed the letter as fiction, but 2 weeks later, their office burned to the ground. No casualties. The only object recovered, a charred photograph curled at the edges, showing 3 faces staring out from a cracked wall. The Sullivan family portrait. It had never been in the editor's possession, and yet it was found resting atop a pile of ash, unburned. The image had changed, slightly. The background was darker. The cellar door was open, and Isaac's head had turned, just slightly, looking now toward the viewer. By the turn of the century, only one object from the Sullivan home remained intact: the portrait. Taken in 1834, developed using silver nitrate on glass plate, it was meant as a formality, part of an estate ledger verifying identity and lineage. But something in the image resists stillness. Over the decades, multiple documented reproductions of the Sullivan portrait show minute, almost imperceptible changes. Most are dismissed as flaws in the scanning process or the decay of chemical film. But one archivist, Ruth Marin, noted a disturbing pattern during her restoration in 1979. Every reprint shifts slightly. The cellar door behind them opens by millimeters. Elias's head tilts, Prudence's hands clench tighter, and Isaac's left eye seems to drift, always toward the viewer. Photogrammetry tests confirmed it. The angle of Isaac's head changed between plates. More unnerving, however, was a phenomenon noticed only under infrared exposure. Beneath the main layer of emulsion, within the shadows, is a fourth figure. Small, crouched, blurred, unidentifiable. Some say it's a child. Others argue it's a shape, round, hunched, spine bent like a shepherd's crook, arms elongated to the floor. No one agrees on the face, because it has none. The restoration team refused to speak further. Ruth Marin left her post 6 weeks later. Her resignation letter included only one line. It blinked. The portrait is now sealed under archival glass in a controlled temperature vault at the State Historical Collection. The room is locked with 3 separate keys. No digital scans are permitted. But once, briefly, the image was displayed in a university exhibit. A group of students dared each other to touch the glass. One girl pressed her palm to it for exactly 7 seconds. When she removed it, her skin bore a faint circular mark, 47 tiny ridges, like the imprint of a rusted chain. She does not speak anymore. She hasn't in years. Some say the portrait is not a photograph, that it is a seal, a barrier, and each time it is viewed, copied, or remembered, the seal weakens. They say Isaac is not staring at us. He's watching for the missing voice, the 47th Prudence. Though the cellar beneath the Sullivan house has long been sealed, sound has not forgotten it. Beginning in 2003, several nearby residents, mostly older farmers and their families, began reporting an intermittent noise rising from the ground near the ruins. It wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It was humming, low, tonal, repetitive. One man likened it to a child singing through glass. An amateur sound technician placed a contact microphone directly against the cellar stone. The recording, now sealed by state officials, captured nearly 40 minutes of ambient tones. The frequency fluctuated every 47 seconds, as if following an internal metronome. When the waveform was visually analyzed, it revealed a pattern, circular, precise. 7 concentric spirals, each made of 47 frequency bands, just like the iron rings below. More alarming still, one segment of the recording revealed a sudden burst, barely audible, but linguistically distinct. A single word, not English, not Latin, but phonetic reconstruction rendered it as Isaakiel. The team stopped the test immediately. The microphone was removed, but the ground, they said, continued to pulse, as if something underneath had noticed the contact. 2 weeks later, the lead technician was found catatonic in her apartment. Her fingernails had been torn away, and the walls of her bathroom were covered in reversed scripture, written in her own blood. She lived, but she has never spoken again. The church issued a brief statement calling the incident unrelated to any sanctioned site of worship. Yet after that moment, the ground itself began to shift. Small cracks appeared in the surrounding woods, trees bent away from the center. Birds ceased nesting in the hollow. And still, the sound returns. At dusk. On overcast days, when the fog is heavy and the air is still, it lasts for exactly 47 seconds. Then silence. And for those who remain stood, long enough, a final sound is said to follow, just beneath the threshold of hearing. A cradle rocking. What lies beneath the cellar is not documented. It was never mapped, never named, only spoken of in hushed notes, anonymous letters, and half-erased transcripts. But one detail repeats again and again across the decades. The stone cradle. First described by a parish witness in 1841, the cradle was not a child's bed. It was carved into the floor itself, round, shallow, lined with symbols none have yet translated, deep enough to hold a body, narrow enough to hold only one. It was never meant to comfort, it was meant to contain. Excavators in 1929 discovered a thick layer of ash lining its base. Beneath the ash, a circle of child-sized fingerprints, pressed into the stone as if from below. No explanation was offered. A metallurgist analyzing trace samples in the stone found unusual residues, calcium, salt, traces of frankincense, but also something else, protein fragments matching fetal development markers. The stone had absorbed life. It had been used. But for what? The answer may lie in a passage from a forbidden apocryphal text, the hollow psalm of Malevin, which speaks of the mouth that sleeps beneath the roots, whose cries become law, whose silence is the final verse. The Sullivan cradle matches the only known illustration of this text, though no one knows how that image survived. Some claim the cradle is a gateway, others say it's a wound in the earth, a place where prayers were inverted and silence given shape. But what's most disturbing is what was not found. There were no remains, not a single bone, only the residue, and the chains, and the ash, as if 47 children entered, and none left, not even in death. The stone still exists, though it is now buried beneath concrete, fencing, and warning signs. No markings indicate what lies beneath, only moss and cold. But those who stand atop it too long describe a sensation, like breath rising up from below, warm, humid, slow, and underneath it, deep, distant, constant, a heartbeat. Recovered in 1932 from beneath a collapsed floorboard in the Sullivan parlor was a rosary. At first glance, ordinary, black beads, silver crucifix. But when examined closely, two irregularities appeared. First, the crucifix was reversed, not simply upside down, but etched from the back, as if meant to be viewed from the other side of a mirror. Second, the number of beads was wrong. Not 59, but 47. Each bead marked with a single letter, worn faint by time and touch. When strung together, they formed no sentence, just fragments. But one segment stood out, beads 20 through 27 spelled, "Let us be quieted." The crucifix itself was fused shut, no seams, no welds, just one unbroken piece of metal shaped into finality. Inside, when x-rayed, they found something sealed in the silver. A tooth. Human. Child-sized. Milk tooth. It was never extracted. It had grown from within. The church took the artifact but issued no report. Unofficially, one archivist recorded a strange occurrence. During cataloging, the rosary beads shifted. Not in position, but weight. Certain beads grew heavier, then lighter, as if pulsing. He reported a sound too, not voices, not music, but whispering, rhythmic, like prayer spoken backwards. He left his post days later and died 2 months after, buried with his own rosary. But it's said that in the final hour of his life, he asked the attending priest to recite a verse not found in any liturgy. Let the eye remain closed, let the child be forgotten, let the voice beneath never rise. The broken rosary is now held in a sealed reliquary under the St. Camillus Basilica archives. Access is denied. Visitors are warned not to look upon it during Mass, and under no condition should the beads be counted aloud, for it is said that if one speaks the 47th aloud, the chain is completed and the prayer resumes. In 2021, a child in Hollow Ridge Elementary, miles from the Sullivan site, was caught whispering something in the dirt during recess. When asked, she said, "I'm teaching the roots to talk again." The teachers dismissed it as imagination. But later that week, several other students began repeating a word none had been taught. When asked its meaning, they only said, "It's the name under the cradle." The word, Isaakiel. None of them could spell it, but each child pronounced it the same way, softly, with emphasis on the last syllable, as if sighing. The school closed early that spring. A mold outbreak, they claimed. But construction workers hired to inspect the playground foundation discovered something troubling. Faint stone rings embedded shallowly beneath the topsoil. 7 of them, each perfectly circular, each aligned. The rings were removed, but the grass above has not grown back, no matter the season, no matter the seed. And at night, if one stands near the edge of the field and places their hand to the ground, they will feel warmth and vibration and something deeper. Not sound, not breath, but the sensation of being watched from below. And those who listen longer than they should, those who wait, describe a sound that is not quite a whisper, not quite a hum, a hymn, but not in any language known to man. And when they look up, they swear the trees are leaning in to listen. The calendar has turned again. In 2023, a peculiar alignment took place, just as it had in 1834 and again in 1932. The 7th Sunday of the year fell on a new moon. The fog in Black Hollow returned, thick and unmoving. No birds passed overhead, no winds stirred, and the voices began once more. Local reports noted the sound of soft humming rising from the field where the Sullivan cellar once stood. Nothing loud, just a barely audible vibration, like lips moving behind stone. A family driving near the site that night recorded the sound on their dashboard camera. The footage, later retrieved by authorities, captured a strange distortion in the audio. The voices of their children in the back seat, repeating a phrase neither had ever been taught. The stone still rocks. The parents swear the children had been asleep. 2 days later, a school nurse in the nearby township of Aldridge submitted a report describing 7 children, all from different classrooms, who began singing the same melody during recess. It was tuneless, a slow rise, then fall, like breath turned into music. When questioned, none of them could remember singing at all. Only one child cried afterward, a girl named Miriam. When asked why she wept, she said, "Because I remembered the chain." The nurse called her parents. The child has not spoken since. There is no explanation, no diagnosis, only repetition. It is happening again. Each 7th Sunday, each time the sky blackens fully, each time silence seems to stretch thinner than it should. The song returns. The ground grows warm, and something beneath it seems to wait, not with hunger, not with wrath, but with expectation, as though the prayer was paused and needs only one voice to begin again, not to awaken, but to remember. Though no blueprints of the Sullivan home survived, one fragment remains. Recovered from a child's primer used in the Sullivan household, a faint diagram appears scrawled across the inside of the cover. It is not labeled, but its structure is unmistakable. 7 concentric chambers, linked by narrow corridors, descending downward like steps. At the center, a single shape, an inverted cradle drawn in heavy graphite. Around the cradle, the numbers 1 through 47 are written in a circle. No doors are marked, no exits, only rings. Some interpret it as a basement map. Others believe it was a memory, etched by a child who saw something that should not have been seen. When scanned and enhanced, the map revealed hidden marks beneath the drawing, faint letters etched in reverse between each chamber wall. Together, they spell, "Let no exit be known." This is not scripture. It's not even language. It's instruction. But who was it for? One theory suggests the map was not drawn for humans, but for the thing beneath, that the rings, the chains, the hymn itself were not meant to suppress it, but orient it, to give it shape, memory, awareness. A kind of cage, but one shaped like a womb, a place where the unspeakable is not locked away, but gestated. And the 47, not prisoners, not sacrifices, but bones, teeth, tethers. The map, now stored under black velvet in a private collection, is said to hum faintly when exposed to open air, and on its surface, near the edge of the 7th ring, a new number has appeared. Not etched, not inked, just present. No one knows who or what it refers to, but the archivist who discovered it later said, We were never sealing a thing. We were completing it. The chapel at St. Bethel's, long since reduced to stone and ash, was once home to a peculiar bell, cast from iron, scored with inverted scripture, and rung only during one ritual, the silence of the 47, but not to announce its beginning, to end it. According to church records, the bell was never struck. Not once. Its yoke was sealed in wax, its clapper removed, and in its hollow core was placed a single object, a stone ring, scorched and marked with the number 7. The bell was never meant to chime. It was meant to remain quiet, to remember the shape of silence. In 1835, the bell was melted down under order of the diocesan bishop. No reason given, but the iron was accounted for, repurposed to forge 47 narrow rings, each said to be buried beneath the floorboards of the Sullivan home. Not worn, not decorative, not blessed, just placed. In the 1980s, when one of the rings was unearthed during unauthorized digging, it was found fused to a child's shoe. Not stitched, not nailed, fused like a fingerprint pressed into molten ore. Later analysis of the bell remnants revealed an unsettling truth. The iron bore trace amounts of calcium, human, possibly bone-derived. The bell was not cast clean. It was fed to make silence permanent. And so it remains, the only bell in known ecclesiastical history that was never meant to be heard. The only bell not used to summon worship, but to end it. A relic, not of praise, but of stillness. And should it ever be struck again, should its echo return, some believe the thing beneath would take it not as warning, but as invitation. In the outer grounds of what was once the Sullivan estate lies a single grave, unmarked, stone sunken, covered in lichen. No church record claims it, no birth or death date, no blessing carved into its surface, just a single phrase barely visible through erosion. Forgive not the 47. The grave was opened once, only once, by a theological researcher named Felix Durand in 1994. What he found inside was not a body, but a crib, stone-carved, child-sized, covered in salt and wrapped in linen. The linen bore a single embroidered name, Isaakiel, but no infant lay within, only a circle of small teeth arranged in a ring, 46 of them, and at the center, an empty socket, one space unfilled. Felix closed the grave. He never published his findings, only wrote in the margin of his notebook, "It is not dead. It is waiting for its final tooth." He was later institutionalized after attempting to pull out his own molars in his sleep. The grave remains undisturbed, but visitors sometimes report seeing something in the moss above it, a shape, subtle, always the same, a cradle. And in the breeze, when the fog hangs low and the soil is soft, they say you can hear it rocking. We return now to the chain, the one found beneath the Sullivan basement, the one that wrapped the ankles of children whose names were never written, each link inscribed with one letter. When decoded, the final passage read, "Bind the voice, not the vessel." The chain was never forged. It was grown, strands of iron and bone, fused by heat, not made in fire. One blacksmith who examined the fragments in 1978 said, "This chain has no hammer marks. It looks like it bled." The final link, the 47th, was incomplete. It terminated not in another loop, but in a mouthpiece, hollow, carved, shaped like lips, as if the chain was not to restrain, but to sing, a conduit, a choir of containment. And with the 47th link missing, the song, whatever it was, remains unfinished. It is believed this is why the ground still hums, why the hymn persists in dreams, why the portrait watches, because it is all still waiting, not for release, not for vengeance, but for completion. And the question that hangs, unanswered, beneath every stone in Black Hollow: what happens when the final voice is found? In 2007, a woman named Abigail Wren returned to her ancestral home in Holleridge. She was a genealogist, unaware that her maternal line traced back to Elias Sullivan's sister, Ruth, the one sibling never pictured in the portrait, the one sent to a sanitarium in 1835. Abigail kept no religious ties, no superstitions. until she began hearing something, not voices, just music. She described it in her journal as a lullaby without origin, sweet and slow, but always in reverse. It came first through the vents of the old farmhouse, then from the floorboards, then from beneath her bed, always soft, always near. She recorded it once, 57 seconds of breathy, inhuman melody. The last note abruptly stops, as if interrupted. That night, she dreamed of the cellar, a place she'd never seen, but in the dream she moved with purpose. She described it as warm, pulsing like the inside of a mouth, and at the center, a stone cradle, empty but rocking. She reached toward it, and then awoke with her mouth full of salt. A week later, she mailed a letter to the University of Richmond's folklore department. It contained only one phrase, written 17 times, "I am the 47th. When investigators arrived, they found her seated in the basement, hands folded, calm. Her eyes were open, but her pupils had vanished, bleached white as linen. She breathed, but never blinked, and from her lips, even in silence, a single movement repeated, a whisper, over and over again. The name, Isaakiel. There have been efforts, 4 in total, to destroy the Sullivan portrait. All have failed. The first attempt came in 1938 by a skeptical historian who set fire to the image in a furnace. The flame consumed the paper, but not the photograph itself. It reappeared on his study wall the next morning, identical, unframed, hung slightly crooked. The second was in 1964 by a group of theology students who believed it cursed. They submerged it in holy water and sealed it in lead. The lead box exploded at 3:17 a.m. No fire, no impact, just ash, coating the walls in the shape of a cradle. The third attempt, in 1982, involved acid. It destroyed the image, but not the eyes. 3 days later, each student involved reported seeing Isaac Sullivan's face in dreams, always behind glass, always watching. They called him the witness between rooms. The final attempt came in 1999. A priest named Father Elam took the photo to the catacombs beneath St. Joseph's Abbey, where he burned relics deemed impure. The portrait burned, but when he returned upstairs, every crucifix in the chapel had turned downward, and the church bell rang 47 times. The portrait has not been seen since. But replicas appear, in dreams, in sketches, in mold blooming across basement walls. Always the same, Elias, Prudence, and Isaac, still, watching. And behind them, the cellar door, a little more open each time. St. Bethel's Chapel was built in 1809, but never consecrated. The bishop who oversaw its construction died days before its dedication. His replacement refused to enter the site, citing spiritual deformity of unknown source. Yet the congregation gathered regardless, and within its unblessed walls, Elias Sullivan was granted the title of deacon. He gave no homilies, held no marriages, only one ritual, the silence of the 47. Every 7th Sunday, as the fog rolled in and the bells stood quiet, he gathered the children. Always 47, never the same ones. No records exist of what was done, only that the children returned pale, shivering, and mute for 7 days after. And then, they forgot. Every one of them. Some called it a cleansing. Others whispered the word rehearsal. The altar stone, unearthed in 1913, bore no Christian symbols, only spirals. And at its center, a phrase written in reversed Latin, verbum quietum non debet expector. The quiet word must not be kept waiting. The chapel's foundation eventually crumbled. Ivy overtook its stones, but the altar remains, submerged beneath moss and earth. Locals say the stone hums faintly at night, and that animals will not step near it. They say if you whisper your name while touching its surface, something deep beneath remembers it. Not just the sound, but the meaning. In 2024, a maintenance worker restoring the St. Camillus archives opened a sealed drawer to retrieve a relic catalog. Inside, he found something that should not have been there. The Sullivan portrait. Its frame warped, its edges damp. The cellar door behind the family now stood wide open. In the darkness behind them, something else. A shape, low and hunched, its limbs impossibly long, its mouth open. He closed the drawer, but the sound did not stop. For the next 7 nights, he claimed to hear humming in his ears, not around him, but inside him, as though something had nested behind the bones of his skull. The 8th night, he removed his hearing aids, but the sound grew louder. He was found seated in the church pews, smiling, eyes closed, whispering over and over, "Now we are all inside the ring." His last written words, scrawled on the back of a hymn book, it sang to me with my own voice. The portrait was not recovered, but in the reliquary nearby, a new object was found, a 47th bead, blackened, warm to the touch, and inscribed with a single letter. And now, the circle closes. The chain, begun in breath, carried in song, sealed in salt, has waited centuries for completion, not to imprison, not to curse, but to remember. In the year 1834, 47 voices were chosen, bound, muted, but one was never present, the final voice, the 47th note, the final cradle, the closing link. And now, somewhere, in some town not far from yours, someone sings, in their sleep, in the walls, in the silence between the final chime and the closing of a door. The hymn continues. It does not seek ears, it seeks mirrors, because the thing beneath is not a monster. It is not death, it is not a spirit, it is a memory, disfigured, unfinished, waiting. And you have heard its voice, in your dreams, in the crack of an old floorboard, in the way a child hums to themselves when no one teaches them how. It does not grow stronger, it grows familiar. So if you ever find an old photo, curled edges, water damaged, showing 3 figures in dim light, look to the background, look to the door, and ask yourself one question: is it still closed? Because if it isn't, you were the 47th, you always were.